Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. Today my co-host Leroy Hill and I are joined by Richard Weikart to offer a biblically sound and philosophically robust discussion of Charles Darwin's 1871 book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. We'll show how Darwin's godless philosophy of human evolution stands behind many of today's moral conflicts, shaped the Western worldview, and maybe even deformed the worldview of many Christians. So before we dive into his book, let me offer a little background. Charles Darwin was born in 1809 to Robert Darwin and Susanna Wedgwood. From his earliest days, Charles dreamed of making discoveries that could help him and his children unlock the mysteries of nature. His father, a successful physician, didn't understand young Charles' fascination, so he sent Charles to Edinburgh, Scotland to study medicine. Still, Charles' interest in science persisted, and his father, frustrated with his son, sent him to Cambridge, England to become a country clergyman in the Anglican Church. Despite his change in vocation, Darwin pursued his study of nature. Eventually, in 1831, a professor of botany at Cambridge, J.S. Harslow, was impressed with Darwin's work and arranged for Darwin's appointment as a naturalist in the government ship HMS Beagle. Throughout his travels, Darwin's interest in coral reefs, island animal relationships, and fossil comparisons were heavily influenced by Charles Lyell's gradualistic and uniformitarian geology. In 1836, Darwin returned to London to organize and publish his findings. In time, he became friends with Lyell and the noted English botanist Joseph Hooker. In 1839, he married his cousin, Emma Wedgworth, and yes, both Charles and Emma were the grandchildren of wealthy businessman Josiah Wedgwood, whose innovations in pottery such as green glaze, creamware, and jasperware made his family very wealthy. By late 1842, Darwin's ill health forced his move to Down, where he lived in seclusion for the rest of his days. He died on April 19, 1882. His wife and 7 children wanted him buried near their home in Down, but he was eventually buried next to Sir Isaac Newton in Westminster Abbey. During his last 40 years of life, Darwin developed his philosophy that just like the rocks, all species of living creatures were formed gradually with slight modifications over long periods of time. Selection, wrote Darwin, was the keystone of man's success, but how selection could be applied to organisms living in a state of nature remained for some time a mystery. End quote. This mystery, however, was solved in Darwin's mind when he read the 1798 publication, An Essay on the Principles of Population by Thomas Robert Malthus. Darwin's big takeaway from Malthus' work was that favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones destroyed. The result would be, he concluded, the formation of a new species. Here then, he said, I had at last a theory by which to work. But Darwin, against the advice of Lyell and Hooker, delayed publication of his theory. This delay came back to haunt Darwin when in the summer of 1858, Alfred Russel Wallace came out with his own essay on natural selection. Darwin was upset by this turn of events and took the old adage, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em to heart, and he decided to co-publish Wallace's essay with his own introduction. This work was titled On the Tendency of Species to Form Varieties, on the Perpetuation of Varieties and Species by Natural Means of Selection. A year later, on November 24, 1859, The Origin of the Species was published by Darwin. In his seminal work, Darwin promised his readers, quote, light would be thrown on the origin of man and his history. The public response to Darwin's work was heated. In the middle of the 20th century, the noted atheist thinker Mortimer Adler looked back on this time and wrote the following. The entire first edition of 1,250 copies was sold on the first day of publication. A storm of controversy arose over the book, reaching its heights at a meeting in the British Association at Oxford, where the celebrated duel between T.H. Huxley and Bishop William Wilberforce took place. Darwin, who could not sleep when he answered an antagonist harshly, took Lyell's advice and saved both time and temper by avoiding the fray. 12 years later, in 1871, Darwin published his second great book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. According to Darwin, quote, the sole object of this work is to consider firstly whether man, like every other species, is descended from some pre-existing form. Secondly, the manner of his development, and thirdly, the value of the differences between the so-called races of men. In substance, Darwin's argument from Origin of the Species was directly applied to Descent of Man. In Weikart's book, He updates one of Darwin's most infamous quotes on natural selection of species to make Darwin's argument regarding human origins much more clear. It reads something like this: as many more humans are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any human, if he vary however slightly in any manner profitable to himself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, he will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected human will tend to propagate their new and modified form. It is this thesis and its impact on the Western world we will explore in depth on today's podcast. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. Leroy, glad you could join us. Finally, Richard and I have been waiting forever. That's why we're starting late. As always, it's Leroy's fault. So just wanted to make sure everybody knows that. Leroy has no excuses. It's just what Leroy does. Right, Leroy?
Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't check the email. He gives me an email account, apparently says, oh, but I don't check that email account. Well, give me a better email account. But he doesn't give, I don't know what I'm going to do. It's like catch-22. I can't win, Leroy.
Can't win.
Oh, now you're quiet, man. No pushback from you today. All right. You must be waking up or something. No pushback today. No. That'll be the first time in 10 years that we've known each other. You've never given me any pushback.
Yeah. Today is a good day.
Today's a good day. Why is it a good day?
Well, I'm sitting in my office, so it's a really good day.
Okay, well then it's a good day. I'll let it go with that. Well, Richard, you get to be in the middle of this, literally, on video side, and in other ways, figuratively. So, welcome, Richard Weikart. Richard's been on the podcast before. Matter of fact, I re-released an old interview that he had done. We talked about eugenics and Darwin and some other things. So that's just a few episodes back. If folks want to catch up on that, I'll link it in the show notes later on. But Richard, for those that haven't heard that episode or new or haven't read any of your many, many writings, just tell everyone a little bit about yourself, what you've done in the past, and a little bit about, we talked about pre-show, about your book project you're working on.
Yeah, I'm an emeritus professor at California State University, Stanislaus, which means I'm retired, but I taught there for 30 years. I've written pretty extensively about the history of Darwinism, especially in Germany. Germany's been sort of my main geographic focus, but I've also delved into Darwin's own writings and the Anglo-American scene a good bit too. In fact, in my book, Darwinian Racism, which just came out a couple of years ago, I have a whole chapter on Darwin's racism that looks at the book we're looking at today, The Descent of Man, and as well as other things, and looking at the way that Darwin viewed races. And we'll be getting into that, I'm sure, here today a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then I've also written a number of other books relating to the history of Darwinism. Also, more recently, I published a book about the history of euthanasia and assisted suicide. It's called Unnatural Death. It came out last year. And right now I'm working on a new kind of project. I've been working on the dark side historically over the past part of my career, Darwinism, eugenics, racism. So now I'm turning to the light side, and I'm doing a book about the history of the German Awakening movement, which was Christian revivals that broke out in 1816 in Germany. And I'm covering the period about 1816 to 1840. I'm covering some the lead up to it and some of the aftermath too, but mainly focusing on 1816 to 1840 in Germany and looking at the way that God moved among the people in Germany at that time.
That's awesome, man. We'll probably have to have you around, maybe do a little show once the book is released, maybe this summer, or have you write something for the More Than Cake site or something. We'll figure something out, but we'll get a promo.
Yeah, I'm hoping I can finish the book by this summer, but probably it's not going to be released for another year or two after that. We'll see how things work with the publishing process and everything. So,
yeah. Okay, well, that's good, man. I'm glad you could join us for this. This is definitely a show up your alley. By the way, before we jump in, I almost forgot to mention, I'm going to put my hat in here for the people watching live. So my little Be Nice Scene hat. This is a little homage to the 1700th anniversary this year of the Nicene Creed. And so shameless plug, you can buy that in my shop. I did my little design there. But anyway, so it's my little fun plug for the Nicene Creed. I use it in a lot of my worldview classes anyway. It's a great creedal formation for unity between the three main branches of Christianity. So that's why I'm wearing a special hat today, in case anybody's wondering why it's that hat and not my little flat cap. Anyway, so back to our show. Here's what I want to do for our worldview questions. So because Descent of Man isn't really obviously it engages philosophically with the idea of human origins and evolutionary theories. But Darwin isn't a philosopher in the sense that he's not really writing out a comprehensive worldview and shaping that. So when we're trying to unpack these worldview ideas, they don't always fit nicely into these questions, even though his worldview does address these. So we're going to have to do some analysis and synthesis of things here. And the way to keep it simpler is we're going to start with our two questions. Our beginning question is, how did I come into being? And we're also going to look at sort of the what happens when I die type of question, because I think it makes sense in his overall worldview to fit that in. And obviously, we can start to dialogue about his background, where he's from. Here's a little bit I found interesting, and then I'm going to throw it to you guys to where you see him land in this. So Darwin's family, interestingly enough, they attended, from what I understand, a Unitarian church in Shrewsbury, England, during Charles' early years. And so Unitarianism at that time was a theologically liberal Christian denomination that rejected things like the Trinity. And they emphasized reason and individual conscience over traditional church doctrines. So it was a religious background, but certainly not a orthodox in the sense of Protestant orthodoxy as maybe you and I would understand that. And then later in life, of course, his dad tries to drive him into the medical field, but he's driven to science. But he kind of, almost like a punishment, I guess, sort of forces him to become an Anglican minister. It seems like, at least that's my kind of take on it. It seems like, well, if you're not going to do what I want, you're going to force you to be this. And I don't know where he was ever theologically in that, but he did have that sort of education, a little bit of background. But in 1876, Darwin described himself as agnostic, stating he could not believe in a God who allowed the suffering he observed in nature, though he remained respectful of other belief systems. So in those questions of human, where did I come from and what happens when I die, it seems like he has some sort of at least agnostic, possibly atheist, and then there's debate on this. How would you guys describe his worldview for human origins, and was there a God, was there not a God, and how does that impact those answers to those questions in your thinking? I'll let Richard maybe jump in first, since he's probably answered this question a million times. So,
yeah, Darwin, as you suggested, did claim to be an agnostic. He didn't claim that he knew for sure that there was not a God, but agnosticism was a position that believed that you not only that you didn't know about God or if there's a God or not, but in the strong sense that most the people, such as Thomas Henry Huxley, coined the term agnosticism that Darwin used. Thomas Henry Huxley and many of the other people that used the term agnosticism in the 19th century didn't just mean that they didn't know whether there was a God or not. They meant that it's impossible to know whether there's a God or not. And so there's this sense of complete skepticism about even the possibility of knowledge about a God. And that's pretty much the position that Darwin took. He didn't think that there really was a way to know if there's a God or not. But if there was a God, Darwin certainly didn't think God had anything to do with the process of evolution. He certainly didn't think that there was any kind of divine intervention in creating species and creating the world, the universe. I mean, basically, he thought that all of nature came into existence without the intervention of any kind of God. So certainly, he holds out the possibility, okay, there might be a God out there somewhere, but if so, he didn't really do anything is significant. Now, actually, in his writings, Darwin at times does try to sort of throw in a thing of saying, well, God could have created the laws of nature. He does actually say that in The Origin of Species, for example. He says that God could have created the laws of nature, but there's a sense in which even in his agnosticism, he thinks if there is a God, it must be a deistic kind of God. That is a God that, created the world and then just let things run. And for Darwin, that meant that he could have created natural laws and part of these natural laws are evolutionary laws, according to Darwin. And then he just let things run, and things came into creation by themselves. So he didn't think that God was intervening in any kind of way in human history or in geologic history, for that matter.
Leroy, what do you think? What does that do to our answer to those questions? Where did I come from? What happens when I die? What do you see his ideas?
It's very interesting. I try to think about it a little bit differently, and thought to myself that Darwin is on a world building exercise. Darwin is attempting. I mean, I don't know if he would express it that way, but he's attempting to craft a view of the world that makes sense to his mind. I mean, think about the Unitarian worldview, and even in the times in which Darwin, is really writing and thinking. The deist worldview is a legitimate or a live option for some to believe. I'm not, I'm with Richard. I don't think for an instance that Darwin is attempting to articulate an active God, but he's engaged in a world building exercise. So he's attempting to craft an understanding of the world that is not rooted in anything supernatural or anything, I hesitate to say existential, but he's attempting to craft a world that makes sense to his mind and sense to the minds of the people who are living at the time. And that God wouldn't include any kind of a Christian God or any kind of active God or any kind of personal God. So an impersonal God would fit the kind of world that Darwin is attempting to craft, if that makes sense. I mean, at least that's how I thought about it.
So do you guys think, as you're both talking, here's the kind of the question I might have then, if I'm buying into Darwin's ideas and I'm thinking through this, and I ask those questions, where did I come? What's my origin? What's my destiny past this life? Would Darwin just simply say it doesn't matter, or you can just pick your own thing? It doesn't really matter to his system, or it didn't matter to him? What do you think would be the direction he would go with that?
Well, of course, in terms of the origin, he claimed that he was trying to show that there were natural scientific laws that he thought he had discovered or could discover that would be able to explain how humans came into existence. So when you're thinking about, how we got here, obviously he's trying to provide a scientific explanation, a naturalistic explanation based entirely upon nature. In fact, when he was actually pressed about the origin of life, because his theory doesn't say anything about the origin of life, his theory just presupposes that life is already existing and already reproducing, and that it's evolving over time. He doesn't really say anything in The Origin of Species, his earlier book of 1859, or in The Descent of Man, about how life actually arose. But in his correspondence and other times when he was approaching that question of how did life actually arise, he didn't think that God did it. He thought that it came about, again, through completely natural processes. He said, there could have been some pond with, organic chemicals that, combined and such randomly. So he doesn't believe that God was involved in any kind of way. And so this also then impinges, I think, on his view of what our destiny or our future is as well. Our future is the universe is just going to keep evolving until finally it goes extinct. And Darwin really didn't speculate about cosmological kind of bigger issues, astronomy and things like that. But obviously, at some point, the stars are going to burn out if they continue on, and the Earth then the world's going to go extinct. And he didn't believe that. In terms of human destiny, he didn't think that humans had any kind of spirit or soul that was distinct from their physical nature, and that's key here. Because he didn't believe that when he tried to explain things that people in the past had always explained as part of the human soul or human spirit, Darwin always wanted to try to find a naturalistic explanation for those and to try to say that, that's just a little bit, that's sort of like what these other animals have. And so humans just, in fact, Darwin actually framed it this way. He actually used this terminology that humans are not qualitatively distinct or different from other animals. They're only quantitatively different from other animals. What that means is we just have a little bit more of the social instinct and moral sense. We just have a little bit more of, aesthetic sense and other kinds of things than these other animals. Animals have them too. And that's what he was trying to show. He's trying to show that animals have aesthetics, animals have moral sense, animals have social instincts, animals have all these different things that humans had always thought was part of the human soul or spirit. Darwin wanted to say, no, those are just things that animals have, and we just have a little bit more of it.
Leroy, any other words on that?
No, I mean, that really, fleshes out the point. The problem I think that arises is that humans don't frame their lives that way. I mean, humans don't exist in a world where they don't ascribe meaning and deep meaning, to their existence. So as much I think Richard is 100% right. Actually, in describing Darwin's view, it would really strike a discordant note with how most people frame their lives. Obviously, it wouldn't strike a discordant note with those people who believe that humans are, just a step above animals. But for most people, it would really seem out of step with reality and how they see themselves, and even how they live in their own day-to-day lives.
Yeah. Well, I think, and that's what he can't escape, is that when you answer these questions of origin and destiny, it's going to bookend how you deal with the questions of morality and meaning. What is the right thing to do? How should I live my life? What choices should I make about X, Y, Z? And that's really where we'll spend most of our time here, is those other 4 worldview questions that are dealing with purpose of life. How am I going to fulfill that? How am I going to be judged? What's going to be the way the success in my life will be judged? That will I achieve or accomplish or be a good person? What metric do we use? And so whether he knew it or not, or whether he realized it or not, it seems pretty clear that ends up, his origins and destiny philosophy of humanity. And that evolutionary natural selection theory ends up speaking into that part of the society. And so in Weikart's book, the Benjamin Weikart's book, he talks about a few things that I thought were pretty good frames, and he includes some of the common quotes that Darwin, people will use when analyzing Darwin's works. So I just want to read a couple things and get your response to each of these thoughts as we work through. So one of the first points, it seems, in answer to those questions of purpose and morality and justice, Darwin's takeaway seems to be that the value of individual life and racial groups, then, because this is where the tribalist sort of thinking comes in. So individual life and racial groups or tribal groups is very utilitarian and tied to this concept of survival of the fittest. And here's a quote that we can take from Descent. Darwin says, quote, "With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health." And fast forward a couple sentences. "We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It is surprising how soon a want of care or care wrongly directed leads to the degradation of the domestic race, but accepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed." So what does that tell us about these worldview ideas of purpose, meaning, morality?
Well, interesting. I would argue that particular passage that you just read actually was quoted a little bit out of context, because right after the part that you quoted, Darwin goes on to say that nonetheless we should protect the weak and the imbeciles and such. And the reason why, he said, was because we as humans have what he called social instincts. And he uses this notion of social instincts to argue that humans do have morality. So Darwin, when he was framing his theory of human evolution, wrestled a great deal with the issue of morality. If you read his notebooks, you'll see this going on. And he knew that the existence of human morality was one of the strongest arguments against his theory. And so he tried to find a way to integrate it into his theory. And the way he integrated it into his theory was by claiming that what he called social instincts, which he thought was the building blocks that led to morality. He said social instincts are instincts that animals have that allow them to survive and reproduce better than their competitors who don't have those social instincts. And so he would give examples of things like, wolves, a pack of wolves, when the pack of wolves cooperate with each other in a hunt, they have an advantage over a single wolf, who's trying to, hunt for prey and such. Or he would talk, and he said in human society, it's similar to this. And so he said that when humans cooperate, they can achieve more, and thus they can reproduce, they can survive and reproduce at a higher level than if they don't cooperate. And this notion of this cooperation, this social instinct, Darwin thought was the fundamental aspect of morality. But the interesting thing about all of this is what that does, because Darwin thinks that then morality is based upon these social instincts, and social instincts are simply based upon what allows us to survive and reproduce better. There's no objectivity to morality. Morality is simply what is subjectively built into your biological character, whatever is part of your instincts and such. And what's interesting is that, in thinking about my own analysis of things relating to the German scene, Hitler, for example, was using evolutionary ethics of a very similar sort. Hitler also claimed that he was using his instincts, except Darwin's instincts and Hitler's instincts weren't the same. Darwin claimed that social instincts would lead you to the golden rule. He actually argued that very explicitly in his autobiography. He claimed that the social instincts of humans would lead them to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Darwin thought that was the epitome of morality, and that's how he thought he should live his life, and because he thought that's what was built in biologically into him and to his other people. Of course, he didn't recognize that there's a lot of influences upon him in his Victorian society that had caused him to think that. Hitler, on the other hand, said, "My instincts tell me that I need to destroy the Jews." I mean, he said that very explicitly. And so what does Darwin say to Hitler? Well, Darwin in his autobiography said, follow the strongest instincts that you have. But of course, at the time, he thought that was going to be do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But Hitler comes along and says, okay, I'll act upon my strongest instincts. My strongest instinct is we need to destroy the Jews. And so Darwin really doesn't have anything to say objectively about that. Darwin has no objectivity to his morality. Let me give another example, too, that fleshes this out a little bit, too. I was at a conference in 2009, which was celebrating the 150th anniversary of Darwin's Origin of Species and the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birthday, which Darwin was born in 1809, as Origin of Species came out in 1859. And so at this conference I was at, there was a person who was promoting evolutionary. The conference was about evolutionary ethics. And at the conference, a guy who was promoting evolutionary ethics said, look at the black widow. The black widow, the female, eats the male after copulating. And he said, that's nature. And he said, it's just a flip of the coin. And he goes like this. He goes, it's a flip of the coin that we are not like that. It's just a chance event that we don't have that morality also, that the females don't just eat the males after they have sex with them. And then he says, if we had been like, he said, if we had developed that natural tendency, then we would have constructed all our religious and social institutions and everything around that, and that would be what we would be. So it's just a chance event that we have this morality that we have rather than some other morality.
Yeah.
Not only that, okay, so that sort of illustrates, the way that it's just a chance event. That's what Darwin thought. Here's another interesting element to all of this and everything too. Darwin thought that different human races had different morality because he thought different human races had evolved differently and had not only different intellectual capacities. He had very low views of Black Africans and Australian Aborigines and Native Americans, their intellectual abilities, but he also had very low views of their moral traits. He thought that Europeans were superior morally, which I find very ironic because his claim that Europeans have superior moral traits was actually helping to justify genocide, justify killing of masses of people whom they identified as intellectually and morally inferior to them. And by the way, this is going to be the same thing that Hitler's going to do. Hitler is going to claim that the Jews and other races are morally inferior because he thought morality was biologically ingrained, just like Darwin did. And so Hitler thought that these inferior people, by getting rid of these inferior people, by killing off the Jews and gypsies and other groups of people that he thought were inferior, he thought that they were actually elevating the race morally. He thought, we're getting rid of these, greedy, deceitful Jews, and we're replacing them with these honest, hardworking, moral Germans in their place. And so there's a sense in which this notion of morality being biologically ingrained then becomes incredibly dangerous because not only is it subjective, but it also it's differential. Different humans have different levels of it.
Well, it's completely utilitarian. That is, I think, the underlying philosophy is completely utilitarian, and it attempts to escape the context for which these ideas, as we talked about earlier, were birthed. I mean, you talked about it, that Darwin couldn't escape his Victorian, upbringing. Well, his system, embeds, aspects of that Victorian upbringing in the fact that he has to account for morality. I mean, he can't escape not accounting for it. And the very fact that he has to account for it, he has to give it a subjective basis in order for his system to make sense to the average person. And the scary part is that people actually acted out on it. And I was thinking as you were talking, whenever I watch YouTube and I watch these hunting videos where they're watching the animals prey on another animal, it's always interesting to watch the lion or the leopard lay in wait for the pig or to chase down an elk or whatever. It's interesting, and you catch them and you eat them. But that's not interesting when people do that to each other. It's actually downright horrifying and scary when people act that way, because I think there's something innate in us that says that this is inherently wrong. And I think Darwin couldn't escape that idea. And while Darwin, more than likely as a person, would never have agreed with, Hitler's excesses and Hitler's utilization of, or at least similarity of his ideas or outworking of his ideas, nevertheless, he couldn't escape that this is where his ideas, would lead. He didn't lead them there, but his ideas would lead to that kind of human predation on other human beings. And that's horror. That's a horror. And I think we all rightly note that.
Yeah. Well, there's two things. Let me jump in. There's two things I think that are interesting. And I actually put this in because Richard, when he was reading and pushing back on my PhD stuff, and I'd submit the writing, he'd tell me, this is trash, this is terrible. And, well, he never said that. That's just the way I remember it. It was a tragic time in my life. That's the way I remember it, Richard. It was a very difficult time in my life. So yeah, every slightest gentle pushback was like, "Oh, he hates me," and it was just horrible. But anyway, so, but I remember, but it did push me to kind of think like, okay, what is really the argument here? And so, for at least from a worldview perspective, it's really this: any worldview that we have either has to promote an idea. It can reject an idea, or it can allow for an idea. And Darwin didn't promote some of these, eugenic, later labeled eugenic ideas. He had a moral preference not to like certain things. So he tried to sort of, as you said, Richard, try to build those in, like, oh no, it'll naturally lead to loving each other, right? Because he wanted to build in his preference for something. Mm-hmm. But his problem was, and his struggle was, that he had no way to exclude those ideas from his worldview. So his worldview didn't exclude the potential for somebody else saying, well, I do value those things. Mm-hmm. And from a philosophical perspective, as you guys were talking again, here's what it kind of came to mind. He makes this sort of what's called in philosophy a post hoc ergo propter hoc argument. It's an informal fallacy. Sorry to bring in the Latin, but I just love that one. I never remember it all. I have to read it because it's like, I can never remember the order of that one. But it's this informal fallacy that states, since any event Y follows an event X, event Y must have been caused by event X. That's the sort of idea. So in Darwin's language, since social instincts followed natural selection, social instincts must have been caused by natural selection. So it's just this informal fallacy that he makes to try to shoehorn in and sort of bootstrap his preferred ethic into this. But he ends up talking out of both sides of his mouth. And so another quote from his dissent is, this is where it opens up the door. He's like, I don't like this idea. But then he says this. So if various checks do not prevent the reckless, the vicious, and otherwise inferior members of society from increasing at a quicker rate than the better class of men, the nation will retrograde, as has occurred too often in the history of the world. We must remember that progress is no inevitable rule. So he's saying here, like, well, hey, if we allow these sickly or infirm people, we just allow them to willy-nilly breed and grow in numbers, they're going to outnumber the good people. So he builds these eugenic ideas there, although he rejects them at the same time. He's like, I don't want that, but he just can't get away from it. Seems to be his problem.
Well, Francis Galton, his cousin, had already published his things on eugenics before Darwin wrote before he wrote the Descent of Man. And so the passages that you're quoting about the eugenics issues, Darwin is actually responding to Galton and Galton's desires to introduce selection, that is artificial selection, that is humans deciding who's going to propagate the species rather than natural selection. Darwin actually preferred natural selection. He thought natural selection would take care of it for the most part and would actually end up dealing with the problems that eugenics was doing. Darwin was more interested, however, in looking at competition between different races and societies than he was within. So he thought that, do unto others as you have them do unto you. He thought that's, a great thing to be doing, within our society. But he certainly didn't think that was going to be taking place in, with British imperialism and colonialism going on at the time. In fact, he thought that the British going out and exterminating other races, and Darwin does use that term exterminate. In fact, let me read you a passage here from the Descent of Man. Darwin says, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of men will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. And so Darwin believed in racial extermination, and he thought that British imperialism was showing evidence of that. He thought that was basically an evidence for his theory. Because these so-called superior races, the Europeans, whom Darwin thought was superior, he thought were going out and were exterminating other races around the world. So when he's talking about do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, and social instincts, he didn't think those necessarily applied, across the racial boundaries there. And in fact, in a little later in Descent of Man, he says this. Let me read another little short passage here. He says, extinction. So, and by the way, this is in a section. There's a chapter of Darwin's called On the Races of Man. That's the last chapter of the first volume of The Descent of Man. And in that chapter, he has about a 4-page section that is called On the Extinction of the Races of Man. On the extinction of the races of man, because he thought that certain races are going to go extinct. Well, how are they going to go extinct? Well, here's what he says. Extinction follows chiefly from the competition of tribe with tribe and race with race. Various checks are always in action, as specified in the former chapter, which serve to keep down the numbers of each savage tribe, such as period ending. He goes on to talk about these things. But then he says that it's mainly, let me go down here. When one of two adjoining tribes becomes more numerous and powerful than the other, the contest is soon settled by war, slaughter, cannibalism, slavery, and absorption. So he believes that this extinction of races is going to take place as part of the Darwinian struggle for existence, which he thought was taking place within all species. He thought there's a struggle going on. And by the way, one thing that a lot of people may not understand, who don't understand the biology of all this, is that in The Origin of Species, and then as he applies it to humans in The Descent of Man, Darwin claimed that the struggle for existence is most intense within a species, not between different species. Yes, there's competition going on between different species too, but he thought it's most intense within a species because they're competing for the same food supply and the same space and such. And so humans, he thought the same thing is going on. Among humans, the struggle for existence is most intense within the human species, not between the humans and the gorillas or between the humans and the other animals. That's not where the most intense competition is happening. The most intense competition is happening within the human species. And that's going on between racial groups, primarily, according to Darwin. It is happening within society, too. Darwin did stress individual competition, too. So there's competition within society. And by the way, interestingly, while I was working on my dissertation relating to Darwinism, history of Darwinism, I came across a letter where Darwin actually said that he thought trade unions and cooperatives were a bad idea because they minimized competition within society. So Darwin did think about competition within societies being necessary also. But he thought the biggest place it was going on was between different racial groups and such, which would ultimately lead to the extermination of some of those racial groups. And then again, he thinks the Australian Aborigines, the Native Americans, the Black Africans, he sees these as the inferior groups that he thinks ultimately are going to be killed off by the Europeans.
Wow. Leroy, what do you think, man? Darwin wasn't a fan of your people.
Well, I mean,
he was not a fan.
Not at all.
Well, there's an old saying: ideas have consequences. I think back to I think probably the most amazing thing was thinking about Aristotle's writings, right, and how Aristotle is willing to concede that all humans are humans. He wasn't afraid of slavery or anything or an enslaving of man because his ideas allowed for all humans to be humans. But when we think about Darwin, he doesn't even think that those people outside of the European race are, of the same, genetic makeup. And, it reminds me of something that Martin Buber said. Martin Buber said, we have different relationships with eyes than we do with its. And with eyes, we have a me-you kind of relationship. With it's a them or an it. And once you otherize or change things in the it's, you can do to them as you will. You can do with them as you will. You can articulate an existence for them that is substandard, less than human, and allows people to do to things or do to other people what otherwise wouldn't be acceptable among people who you had relationship with. So, when you think of his ideas and you put them on a logical framework and you're just assessing them from a logical perspective, and emotionless, you could see how that it's a very ugly, worldview. It's a very ugly worldview. But it's interesting to me that, as you're, these anecdotes that come out about him, as you read him, he's wrestling within himself with the consequences of his idea. Yet that wrestling doesn't prevent him from still forwarding, the the disgusting aspects of it, because for him it's a logical endeavor. He doesn't see himself as part of the Europeans that are exterminating those folks. He just simply puts it out there and says that others will do this. It's just very, very interesting.
Yeah. What's interesting is that we kind of see this working out, the way this plays out in the 20th century with issues like, let's just say, not just eugenics, right? Because I guess if I had to put a label on it, and Richard, you can tell me if this is not, it's not going to be perfect, but, Darwin might have been more of a positive eugenist. In other words, he didn't want to control or do negative things to people. He just figured it would all get people to cooperate with the way nature wants to work, and eventually it's all going to figure itself out. He wasn't a negative eugenist in the sense of, okay, we need to have laws and force people, and he wanted to try to strike that balance in some way. I guess I'd have to put him in that camp, at least a little bit closer. But when it came to things like immigration and immigration laws, his ideas took stronghold. And I think this is one of our challenges today when we talk about U.S. immigration policy, and we have the open borders type people. And a lot of times when they bristle at the conservative or right side of things and say, oh, we got to restrict this because we have to, we don't want to destroy the culture, or whatever language gets used. There's people that bristle at that because I think some of this language, the way it was used 100 years ago, 120 years ago, gets used now, although we might mean different things, but it's some of the same sort of language of superior culture or better culture. And even if people don't mean it that way now in terms of a othering sense, it's so built into the culture at this point, it's hard to get past the history that Darwin sort of helped foster in the early parts. So let me give one example from this, and then I want to interplay play out on some of this, how it works out in terms of what's the right thing to do and what's the morally good within society. So morality clearly then, at least for those who follow, gets embodied in this eugenic selection. And then there's a guy named George William Hunter who wrote a book, A Civic Biology, in 1917, which became the center of controversy during the Scopes trial, actually, of 1925. And the idea of what was going to be taught in our schools, and could this be taught? It wasn't just about humans evolving from lower animals. It was, what are we going to teach about this, became sort of the center of a lot of those issues. But here's a quote from this textbook. This is the textbook that was being promoted, that was taught, that was used in our public education systems to shape young minds about the view of those who are of the different races, so to speak. And here's what Hunter writes. He says, parasitism and the cost to society. He said, hundreds of families, such as those described above, exist today. And he was talking about the mentally deficient, and he gave examples of, there was families that had generational impact, where somebody maybe had a mental illness, and it got, their kids had it and their kids had it. And therefore there's this idea that there's a very deterministic thing based on natural selection. So poverty could be passed along, and there was sort of a endemic to certain strands of people. And that whole idea was very prevalent. So that's what he's kind of talking about. So he says, hundreds of families such as those described above exist today, spreading disease and immorality. So morality is tied to this biological, traits, right? So spreading disease, immorality, and crime to all parts of the country. The cost to society of such families is very severe. Just as certain animals or plants become parasitic on other plants or animals, these families have become parasitic on society. They not only do harm to others by corrupting, stealing, or spreading disease, but they are actually protected and cared for by the state out of the public money. Largely for them, the poorhouse and the asylum exist. They take from society, but give nothing in return. They are true parasites. The remedy, he writes in this textbook, for young Americans being educated in the schools. The remedy, if such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow this. But we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums and other places, and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibilities of perpetuating such a low and degraded race. Remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe and are now meeting with success in this country. So this became a lot of the moral framework that shaped immigration policies, policies preventing intermarriage. Some 35 states by the middle of the 20th century, I think, had interracial, bans on interracial marriage. This is where a lot of the public welfare system of the Great Society gets implemented, in a large amount of Southern segregation has supported that, because if you're taking government money to live, they can control where you live, and they could use the giving of money to sort of segregate people into different areas of cities so that they wouldn't interact, and therefore they could sort of, under the guise of, I think, kindness, really honestly, they felt that they could end up controlling who could intermarry with who. And I think these ideas start to pervade a lot of public policy. So, at least that's my take on it. And Richard, your thoughts on that, and then we'll jump to you right after that, Leroy. Richard, do we have you?
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay. So what are your thoughts on those things? That's all right.
I lost you for a little bit there. Interestingly, Darwin, because of as we've already discussed, because he made morality non-objective, that is just built in within our biological character, part of our social instincts and such, really didn't have a way of, arbitrating, what's moral and what's not moral, what we can do, what we can't do, and such. But what I find interesting is that many of the people that came after Darwin, who were buying into his theory, began to and the things you read sort of suggest this as well. They began to sort of make Darwinian evolution itself a sort of objective goal. So Darwinism, even though Darwin himself claimed that, and by the way, Darwin was sort of spoke out of both sides of his mouth about this, because Darwin said, on the one hand, that there really is no such thing as higher and lower species. Actually, he wrote this in his notebook at one point about how, don't use the word higher because, it implies that there's something better or whatever. And he didn't think there was anything objectively better or anything. It's just whatever survives and reproduces. That's what is. What is, it is. What is. So interestingly, though, when you read the Origin of Species as well as The Descent of Man, he does use the terms higher and lower all the time about them. And he does, make these judgments about them, this being higher, this being lower. And it's clear when he talks about civilized humans and savage humans that he's making judgments about those things. These are not just neutral terms. And so a lot of these people like Hunter, whom you just read from, they are actually sort of taking the Darwinian process and making it to be their goal. So whatever advances in their view, and again, advance and progress is actually a fudge term, because there's really no way to judge what's progress. Whatever exists. Whatever survives and reproduces. There's nothing that gives it any kind of value. There's no measuring stick by which you can say that this one is better or higher, or except if it just survives and reproduces. So these guys, when they're talking about, if they're talking about, oh no, the imbeciles are going to, out-reproduce us. Well, that means they're more fit. That means they've won the Darwinian struggle for existence. And so, hey, that's what it is. It is what it is, But no, they don't want to say that. They recognize that there's something negative about, mental illnesses and different things. And so they want to say, oh no, we don't want those people to reproduce. So they're actually putting their judgment, they're sort of taking their cultural judgments and infusing them into their theory in a way that their theory does not support. Their theory actually claims that that's not legitimate, but they're doing it anyway. And so they're thinking, okay, we want to advance human evolution. And this is, by the way, what Hitler was doing too. Hitler believed that what he was doing was helping to advance human evolution. It was trying to, bring humans to a higher level by getting rid of these so-called inferior peoples and such. And that's what eugenics was trying to do on a smaller level. They weren't as fanatical as Hitler was about it, but the goal was basically the same thing, trying to advance humans in the evolutionary scale of things.
But doesn't it fit in this sense, Richard? I'll push back on that a little bit. Doesn't it fit in this sense? So in other words, if our moral system is tied to natural selection, I evolved with a certain moral code and ethic, right? Darwin said that would lead me to love my neighbor. But for these eugenists, like we read here, they would say, well, my moral system, which evolved to make me fit to survive, says that I do make a moral judgment against those. So it's still that sort of, it's still that error. They're making an error, that post hoc ergo propter hoc error, but they're saying that if my fitness system, it says it's okay to eliminate these others who I deem as not fit. So it does fit. It's just not the one Darwin wanted to fit, right? Isn't that fair to say? It still fits with natural selection because it's utilitarian at its core.
Sure, mm-hmm. And they can make the claim that this is what my instincts and my moral feelings that are biologically ingrained. This is what tells me to do. You could say that, but then again, you have really no argument against someone who poses a counter argument and says, well, my instinct tells me that I should do something.
That's where might makes right. Might makes right.
Exactly. And interestingly, there was a book that was published in the 1890s that had the title, Might is Right. And the subtitle had something to do with the struggle for existence. I forgot the exact subtitle. But it was written by this obscure guy. And in fact, it was actually written pseudonymously. We're not even sure exactly who wrote it. Ragnar Redbeard is the guy's name that's actually tagged on it. But it actually wasn't really well known at the time in the 1890s. But it got resurrected because Anton LaVey in the 1960s incorporated it into the Satanic Bible. And Might is Right has taken on a life of its own among white supremacists also in the past couple of decades. If you go to white supremacist websites, which I did when I was doing my book, Darwinian Racism, my book Darwinian Racism has a chapter on the white nationalists, and they were using some of these same kinds of arguments about the differences between races having evolved differently and different things like that. And this Might is Right book actually played a prominent role in white nationalist thinking, and maybe still does. I haven't checked in the last 2 or 3 years, but when I write my book Darwinian Racism, it still played a big role. There were white nationalist websites that had PDF files of it and were selling it and other kinds of things like that. This book Might is Right. In fact, there was a guy in California who conducted a mass shooting at the Gilroy Garlic Festival. I think it was in 2017, something around there anyway. And he posted to social media just before he did his mass shooting saying that everyone should read Ragnar Redbeard's Might is Right. And so this notion that might is right, that's essentially what you're left with a Darwinian struggle for existence. Whoever survives and reproduces is right.
Exactly. It's interesting. I just going back a little bit to when you quoted the gentleman Hunt. He embeds his moral system in deciding to use the word parasite. Right, a parasite is something that is absolutely destructive to its host, and in framing his subject as a parasite, he is otherizing it. He's making it something less than human. And what do you do with parasites? You get rid of them. You destroy them. You eradicate them. You exterminate them. And this idea of is embedded in all the discussions that we've been having. There's an idea or a thought that is deeply embedded within it, and it is an idea that frames human. It's anthropological. It frames humans as something. Some humans as human, and other humans as less than human, and its destructive capacity. No matter how they try to spin it or to shape it or to hide it, you cannot escape that fundamental idea that within the human species, so to speak, there are aspects of it that need to be destructed, that need to be destroyed, that need to be wiped out, that need to be done away with. And while it may be that me particularly, I think that they'll interbreed out, they'll through war or whatever, and attrition, they will be wiped out by, themselves. But it's like you just talked about, it's inescapable, this will to power, this idea that the powerful, the strong will do away with the weak, destroy the weak, overtake the weak. That is a moral idea that is being worked out under the guise of some scientific endeavor. But it's a morality that is being worked out, and it is an absolutely destructive one. So I think you said it earlier, Joe, where you talked about it either allows for, or it either promotes, or what was the third one? Allows for, promotes, or
excludes it. It either excludes it, promotes it, or at least allows for it.
It doesn't exclude it. It promotes it. In some of these ideas, it promotes it. It promotes the destruction, and it's breathtaking. I mean, it literally is breathtaking.
Yeah, this is where folks can jump in. Go ahead, Richard. Yeah, go ahead.
And that term that you used there, that Hunter used rather, parasites, it's kind of frightening because that's exactly the term that the Nazis were going to use too about their racial enemies, especially the Jews. They were parasites, and that was how they would justify then exterminating them.
Yeah.
Right.
No, it's crazy.
You can do whatever you want to them. You can do whatever you want to them. I mean, and not only can you do whatever, it's a moral justification to do whatever you want to them, because these are less than human. These are a plague on society. They're an anchor on society's reaching its zenith. And what do you do with anchors? You cut them away. What do you do with parasites? You destroy them. And you either take an active participation in it, or you attempt to exclude them, from society, so that from flourishing, so that they're not a weight on everyone else. It's a really, destructive ideology.
I was standing in line at a grocery store probably about 20 years ago now, and I was listening to this young couple talk about pregnancy, because there was a cover of a Vogue or something like that, and like some princess or queen over in Europe, whatever, whoever they were, down with Britain, whatever. But anyway, they were pregnant. It was like, oh, it's so great, and whatever. And so they were talking about this, and this girl said, oh, why would we celebrate? This is horrible. This is a terrible thing to celebrate. And the guy's like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, a baby's nothing more than a parasite. It feeds off of, it lives off the mother, and it wouldn't survive without her. It's a parasite. And the guy's response to her was not to argue against that, but he said, well, yeah, but some people choose to feed their parasites. And so it was this sort of worldview thinking that, like, well, yeah, it is a parasite, but some people love them. You talked about, you mentioned, people will, if they want to lose weight, they'll ingest a tapeworm, because that will, absorb all the nutrients so they can lose weight. And so then they'll use tapeworms as a weight loss thing. And that was his rationale. There's no difference.
Yeah. The interesting thing about parasites is they're always destructive to the host. They're always, but a baby is not destructive.
Well, yeah, to the mother. There's that. But it was just interesting. That wasn't his argument. That wasn't his argument that a baby isn't destructive. It's not a parasite. He's like, well, some people just like parasites. That was his entire worldview.
But the guy wasn't, as I listen to that, the guy hasn't thought it through, isn't capable of articulating that point, right?
Yeah.
But the very fact, and this is while we're talking about it, it's a crazy thing. When women speak that way, I mean, I've said this before, when women speak that way, they are articulating that they know that they are killing a life. They know that they are eradicating a life. And I think we make a mistake when we don't, hold people accountable, to that idea. As a matter of fact, it says something about our own view of man if we're unwilling to say that the idea that says that I'm going to exterminate this life, I know it's a baby, I'm going to refocus and call it a parasite, and I'm going to eradicate it. the very fact that we let people speak that way and then create laws to shield and protect them, is not merely problematic for their worldview. It also says something about our own worldview, about what we think about people. So it may be that they are actually living out the truthfulness, or what they believe to be the truthfulness of their worldview, while we are, being slowly adopting that idea. I mean, it really is something to think about.
Yeah, and this issue of unborn children, and as well as people who've lost their cognitive capacities, maybe late in life too, is also an issue that sort of flows out of some of this Darwinian thinking that we're talking about here in The Descent of Man. Darwin, of course, doesn't address these issues, but there are people today who, building upon Darwin's ideas, claim that that humans do have differential values of life, that certain humans have value and certain humans don't have value. And they base them on basically different kinds of, a lot of times, cognitive capacities and such. Again, Darwin doesn't make this explicit in The Descent of Man, but by eliminating any kind of objectivity for the value of human life, that is, under the Judeo-Christian worldview, why did humans have value? Because they were created in the image of God. And every human being has this element of the image of God built into them that gives them value. But once Darwin comes along, he says, no, we're in the image of an ape. We're in the image of, an animal. We no longer have this image of God. We no longer have a soul that according to Darwinian kind of thinking, we no longer have a soul that gives any kind of value. And so once you undermine the ideas of the human soul, of the image of God being part of humanity, then it's just based upon our own subjective criteria, whatever we want to interject as the criteria for what gives human value. And again, some philosophers will say rationality, ability to plan the future, other kinds of things like that. And they will define then unborn humans and humans with dementia and such. They will define them as not having value, but of course, then they see themselves as having value. Of course,
or relegating it to a competition for resources. And we were talking about immigration. I mean, people have a right to be upset about immigration, but our sloppy talk about the reasons for being against illegal immigration leads some to think that this Darwinian idea, competition for resources, is at the root of it. And sloppy talk will allow your opponents to take advantage of your maybe right instinct to say, hey, we need to limit immigration and not have illegal immigration. So just throwing it out there.
And there are people, and there are also, Leroy, too, people that look at that and say we need to restrict immigration. And there are the white nationalists, there are the racists who have shared these ideas, and of course they think there's an alliance there because of the sloppy talk, because of the lack of awareness of some of this terminology that was used historically and how that gets recycled. And, we lose sort of cultural awareness of what some of this terminology meant, or where these ideas, how they've built into some of the ways we think or see the world. So we use the language because we've just sort of grown into it, but we don't understand the history of it. And so, but the people that do understand the history think, there's my inroad. There's my way to get my ideas out there and preserve the race, or preserve the superior culture, that kind of language. And they think, that's going to be my inroad. So we need to wrap things up. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, we need to wrap things up.
Go ahead.
Let me do this. I'll come back to you in a second because I'm going to give you a final thought here. So we need to wrap it up, though, because I don't want to go too much longer. But what we like to close with is, and we've been talking about, where do we see it today? We've already listed a bunch of those things. Where do we see these ideas today? But the second question to that is, what is the gospel opportunity here? So maybe if you can pick one or two things where you say, okay, here's the issue that I see, and here's the opportunity for Christians to engage with a sound biblical theology, Christian worldview, and how we could create opportunities to share Christ in the midst of circumstance X or circumstance Y. So where would we see these ideas being pushed out in your mind? What are the critical ones, and how do we use that as an opportunity, not just to complain about it, but actually to bring Christ into the middle of it? Leroy, I'm going to let you go first. So our guest Richard, I'll let him kind of go last, and he'll have time to think about
I'm
that
going to
question.
steal from Richard. I'm going to steal Richard's.
Good idea. Steal from Richard.
Well, it's obviously promoting and articulating and doing better theological reflection on the image of God in man, and utilizing that. I mean, Darwin's weak moral framework, exploiting his utilitarian, philosophical underpinnings, but doing so in such a way that elevates this idea that all men are created in the image of God and are deserving of respect. I like to tell my students here that you've never met a person that is not going to live forever. That individual that you and I speak with, that we often get frustrated with, is valuable. And even in our contemporary discussions about immigration versus illegal immigration, we need to be very careful about how we're talking about people, because obviously, as we said, people are looking to reframe our ideas or to take them out of context because it's very hard to deal with them in context. So I would say a clear articulation of the image of God made in man, a more clear and concise conversations that don't embed these otherizing and racial ideas within our discussion. Yeah, so I would just leave it at that. I don't want to go too much further.
Yeah, I'll jump in and then I'll throw it to you, Richard, for the area I think that we need to be aware of as Christians is that how these ideas have impacted and can impact our theology. I think back to in the early 20th century, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who essentially, using this Darwinian worldview idea, redefined these concepts of compassion. He said biblical love is not to help the poor or the weak or the infirm survive. Love means that we allow them to sort of die their natural death so that we can evolve as a species. And then he ends up embracing almost a sort of a cosmic pantheism, and unite with God, and he viewed image of God as being united to God ultimately as we progressed. So we have to theologically allow ourselves to progress to become image bearers of God. And to do that, we have to make sure that these weak and infirm people aren't really supported in an unnatural way that would keep Christian progress from happening. So he sort of puts a Jesus veneer on that. And so I think the opportunity here is that we have to be careful. And I think we could get this from certain segments of what would be Christian nationalism, not all, because it's a very loose term, obviously. But I think there are some Christian nationalists who have adapted some of this supremacist hierarchical language, and they have put a veneer of Jesus, so they become these sort of Christian white nationalists or others. And so we have to make sure that our language is Christian, is not going to leave room for those views to survive. And I think the gospel opportunity is, like you said, still pointing out that, hey, we stand apart, Christians stand apart from these movements because, Genesis 1:27, we're all B'Tselem Elohim, made in the image of God. And that means we can't allow those views to be seen as compatible in any way with biblical theology. So that's kind of a similar idea, but I think that in that idea of nationalism, I think that we could find some ways to make sure we're carving ourselves out as distinct from that. Richard, thoughts on where we see it or where there's a gospel opportunity?
Yeah, I've given a talk a number of times called "Are You the Image of God or a Cosmic Accident?" And there's this notion out there, and that's embedded within Darwinian theory, that we are just a cosmic accident, that we just came about by chance processes, naturalistic processes over eons of time, and that because of this, on the one hand, those that embrace that worldview believe that we as humans have no meaning, no purpose, no objective morality, and such. And so we have that on one side, sort of the secular worldview. The Christian worldview, though, insists that we are created in the image of God. We do have a purpose. We have a meaning to our life. There is objective morality that we're dealing with. And I think when we think about those two things being contrasted so starkly, I think most people understand at some level, even if they deny it sometimes objectively, even if sometimes they deny it overtly, they understand at some level that human life does have meaning, that human life does have purpose. And I think we can try to sort of tap into that in certain kind of ways. I mean, even people like Bertrand Russell, who in his philosophy, he was one of those famous British philosophers of the 20th century. In his philosophy, he overtly denied that human life had any purpose or any meaning, that there was any kind of morality. But then, if you look at his private life, you find out that he really did think that certain things were moral. And he actually was a campaigner for nuclear disarmament, because he thought it was immoral for us to blow each other up and such. He actually said at one point in a letter that he wrote to a woman he was in love with that he had these notions of there being this supreme being. He says, I don't believe he exists, but it's what's actually made my life good, he said, basically. There's interesting, and I talk about this, by the way, in my book, The Death of Humanity. I spin it out. And I also, by the way, I wrote a pamphlet about this for Rossio Christi. I forgot the exact title of it because they changed the title of it. It originally was entitled, Are You the Image of God or a Cosmic Accident? And then they changed the title to something else. It still has something to do with the image of God and morality, but I don't remember the exact title. But anyway, it argues that these people, even these people denying that there's any kind of morality, themselves actually know that there is morality, there is objective morality. Let me give one example here real quickly. Jerry Coyne, who's a famous atheist, he's a emeritus professor of biology at the University of Chicago. He in his book Reason versus Faith, he said that we should allow for euthanasia of humans because we do it to dogs, and it's a compassionate thing to do. We have compassion on dogs. We don't want them to suffer, so we give them euthanasia. So we should do it for humans too. But if I suggested to Jerry Coyne that we should round up all the homeless people in Chicago, sterilize them, incarcerate them until we can find a home for them, and if we can't find a home for them, then euthanize them, he with his progressive ideology would scream outrage, that I would even suggest such a evil, wicked thing to do. Why? Because, and by the way, what I just described was exactly how we treat dogs.
Mm.
He knows we're not supposed to treat humans the way we treat dogs. Yeah. That's the way we treat dogs in Chicago. You round them up, you sterilize them, you incarcerate them unless you can find a home for them. If you can't find a home for them, you euthanize them. Yeah. He knows we're not supposed to treat humans that way. And people know that. So I think we can try to appeal to these things that people know deep down, even if sometimes overtly they're denying it. I one time was talking with a guy at a conference, at the same conference I mentioned earlier in 2009, about evolutionary ethics. And he was a proponent of evolutionary ethics. He was a philosophy graduate student. And I asked him I said, well, what about Hitler? And he said, well, I don't like Hitler. He told me. And I said, but he went on to say, well, Hitler wasn't objectively evil because there's no objective evil. But he said, I don't like him. He said, so.
Had those conversations, man. It's wild. No, so thank you, gentlemen, for your time. I will, as we close up here, also point out to people, so we've had a lot of these other episodes in this series. When we talked on Marx and Engels, for example, I mean, the Darwinian worldview is, pretty influential in those thinking, in thinking like that. Centering power, like when power becomes the thing that tells us what is right and wrong. You can go back to the Greek philosophers like Thrasymachus, justice is doing good to your friends and harm to your enemies. And then you get that, of course, revitalized in many systems. And I think we've shuffled to that, Machiavellian politics we've talked about through one of our episodes. So there's a lot of these philosophical ideas that work in and borrow from Darwin's ideas. So it's really important for folks to go back and listen to these other episodes we've done on these other works of philosophy and politics, because to see how these thread together and to really make sure that we're not being misled in our Christian faith by buying into ideas that will end up being very destructive to not just our faith, but to our fellow humans, is really critical. So I appreciate you, Richard, coming on for this discussion. Your wisdom and brilliance are always appreciated. Leroy, your wisdom and brilliance are less appreciated, but I still love you for them. So I'm always glad to have you. So, all right.
Darwinian of me.
Very Darwinian of me, right? All right. Blessings, guys. Take care. There is so much more that we could say about Darwin's philosophy of human evolution and how it's lived in our culture. But for now, I want to encourage my brothers and sisters to go out and till the soil of culture so that you can raise the roof and expose your friends and family to the beauty of humanity made in the image of God. I hope you'll come back and join me for the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.